The First Pacific Bank on Wilshire Boulevard was crowded that afternoon. Customers shuffled impatiently in long lines, checking their watches and sighing in frustration. The employees rushed behind the counters, trying to manage the chaos. Linda Carter, a 73-year-old retired school teacher, stood quietly at the counter, clutching an envelope. She had noticed unexpected fees being deducted from her account's small amounts, but enough to affect her limited pension. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "I believe there's been a mistake. I've been charged fees I wasn't informed about." Brittany Wallace, the young teller, barely looked up. "Those are standard maintenance fees, ma'am," she replied flatly. Linda hesitated. "But I've had this account for years and never had these charges before." Brittany sighed dramatically, flipping through the papers. "It's in the fine print," she said, shoving them back. "If you didn't read it, that's not our fault." A few customers chuckled quietly. Linda's cheeks flushed. "If you want to avoid fees," Brittany continued, smirking, "you need to keep more money in your account." Linda's throat tightened. She wasn't asking for favors, just fairness. But as she looked around, she realized no one in the bank cared. At that moment, Carl Jensen, the branch manager, walked over. He had been watching from a distance, arms crossed. "Is there a problem here?" Carl asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really care. "Just a customer who doesn't understand our policies," Brittany replied quickly. Carl turned to Linda with a polite but empty smile. "Ma'am, if you can't maintain the minimum balance, there's nothing we can do." "I've always kept my account in good standing," Linda said firmly. "These fees just appeared. I'm asking for someone to review them." Carl chuckled under his breath. "What's in the system is in the system, ma'am. We don't review automated charges." Then, in a voice loud enough for the entire bank to hear, he added, "If you can't afford the fees, maybe this bank isn't the right place for you." Silence fell over the room. Linda tightened her grip on the envelope, feeling small. Then, a deep voice cut through the air. "Why are you talking to her like that?" Heads turned toward the entrance. A man in a black suit and overcoat stood there. He looked ordinary at first, but there was something about him, his posture, his voice, that made the room tense. Carl turned, irritation flashing across his face. "And who are you to question how we handle our customers?" The man stepped forward, his gaze sharp, his tone controlled. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said. "What matters is why you're treating her like this." The man removed his overcoat. The gasps were instant. "John Wick." Linda Carter felt her heart sink. The room was filled with silent stares, but not a single person spoke up for her. She had spent decades teaching children to stand up for what was right, yet here she was, being dismissed as if she didn't matter. Brittany Wallace leaned on the counter, her smirk growing. "Ma'am, there's nothing we can do. If you can't keep the minimum balance, that's just how the system works." Carl Jensen, the bank manager, chuckled under his breath. "Maybe it's time to find another bank," he added, loud enough for the other customers to hear. A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Linda's face burned with embarrassment. Then, a voice cut through the air. Deep, controlled, and calm. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward the entrance. A man stood there, wearing a black suit and an overcoat. His posture was straight, his presence commanding. His sharp gaze locked onto Carl Jensen. Carl frowned, annoyed at the interruption. "And who are you to tell us how to run our bank?" The man stepped forward, removing his coat in a slow, deliberate motion. The dim overhead lights reflected off his face. The realization hit the crowd like a wave. John Wick. A hushed murmur spread through the bank. Some customers instinctively took a step back. Brittany's confidence flickered. Carl's posture stiffened. John's expression didn't change. He wasn't there to intimidate. He was there for the woman who had just been humiliated. He turned to Linda, his voice softer but just as firm. "Ma'am, what's the issue?" Linda hesitated, as if unsure this was really happening. "I've been charged fees I was never informed about. I just wanted an explanation." John took the envelope from her hands, flipping through the documents with practiced ease. His eyes scanned the details quickly. Then he turned back to Carl. "These fees started appearing 2 months ago?" Carl folded his arms. "That's correct. Policy changes." John nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "And did you notify your customers before implementing these charges?" Carl hesitated. Brittany's hands fidgeted on the counter. "That's irrelevant," Carl said finally. "Policies change all the time. It's not our job to remind people to read the fine print." John exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No. But it is your job to treat customers with respect." Carl let out a dry laugh. "Listen, Mr. Wick, or whatever it is you think you're doing here, this is a private business. You have no authority here." John's gaze darkened. "You're wrong." Carl scoffed. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do? File a complaint? Call corporate?" John tilted his head slightly. "I don't need to." He turned toward the customers. "How many of you have noticed extra charges on your accounts recently?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a man in a work uniform hesitantly raised his hand. A young woman holding a baby followed. Then an elderly couple near the back. More hands went up. Carl's confidence faltered. John turned back to him. "So it's not just her." Carl swallowed hard, realizing the weight of the situation. John leaned forward slightly. His voice dropped, controlled but deadly. "These people have trusted your bank for years. And instead of honesty, you gave them hidden fees. Instead of respect, you gave them humiliation." Carl opened his mouth, but John wasn't done. "You don't check the charges. You don't verify them. You just assume no one will fight back." He tapped the documents in his hands. The room was dead silent. Even Brittany had stopped typing. Carl forced a chuckle, trying to mask his nervousness. "Look, we follow corporate policies. If you have an issue, take it up with them." John raised an eyebrow. "Then let's do that. Pull up her account. Now." Carl hesitated. "What's wrong?" John asked, his voice just above a whisper. "Thought you said everything was clear for people who pay attention." Brittany's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She glanced at Carl, awaiting his approval. Carl hesitated too long. "Now," John repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. With shaky hands, Brittany pulled up Linda's account. The screen loaded, revealing every transaction, every charge. John scanned the data quickly. Then he smirked. Well, he muttered. "Would you look at that?" He tapped the monitor. These fees started 2 months ago, right after a policy change. And not just for her account. John turned back to the customers. "How many of you have been banking here for over 5 years?" Several hands went up. "And how many started seeing new charges around the SA?" Even more hands. Carl's face turned pale. John sighed. "You see where this is going?" Carl was speechless. John turned to Brittany. Reverse every single charge. Not just hers. Everyone's. Carl's voice cracked. You can't just. John's stare froze him mid-sentence. Brittany's fingers moved quickly. One by one, the charges disappeared. Customers leaned in, watching as their balances returned to what they should have been. Murmurs of approval spread through the room. John turned back to Carl. Now. Apologize. Carl clenched his jaw. John took a single step closer. The air in the bank grew heavy. Carl swallowed hard. Mrs. Carter, I apologize for the misunderstanding. John raised an eyebrow. Carl exhaled shakily. I apologize for the way you were treated. It was unacceptable. Linda steadied him, then nodded. Thank you. John glanced around the bank. Let this be a lesson, he said. Stand up. Speak up. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't matter. A slow, quiet admiration filled the room. John Wick had spoken. And just like that, he turned, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the bank. Carl Jensen stood frozen, his mind racing. The situation had spiraled out of control faster than he could have imagined. A few minutes ago, he was confidently dismissing an elderly woman, mocking her in front of a room full of strangers. Now, he found himself face to face with John Wick. And worse, the entire bank was watching. John Wick's presence alone sent a chill through the room. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to make threats. The quiet authority in his tone was enough to turn the tables. His words cut through the air like a blade, sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. You're going to fix this. Carl scoffed, trying to regain control. This is absurd. You think you can just walk in here and... John cut him off with a simple tilt of his head. His piercing gaze locked onto Carl's. I don't think. I know. The weight of those words made Carl's throat tighten. Brittany, the bank teller, shifted nervously behind the counter. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, waiting for an order, whether from Carl or John. Carl hesitated. He wasn't used to being challenged, let alone by someone like John Wick. But what choice did he have? Do it. Brittany swallowed hard and began reversing the fees in Linda's account. The numbers on the screen changed instantly. A few customers leaned in to see. John remained still, his gaze unwavering. All of them, he clarified. Carl clenched his jaw. You're making a scene. John exhaled slowly, unimpressed. No. You made a scene when you mocked her in front of everyone. He turned slightly, addressing the other customers. How many of you were charged these same fees? A moment of silence. Then, one by one, hands started rising. A middle-aged man. A mother holding her baby. An elderly couple near the back. More hands went up. Carl's confidence faltered. John's voice was calm but carried weight. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. You figured elderly customers wouldn't fight back. You counted on their silence. He shook his head. But today, you miscalculated. Carl forced a strained chuckle, trying to salvage his composure. Listen, we follow corporate policy. John raised an eyebrow. Do you? He turned to Brittany. Pull up a few more accounts. Random ones. Brittany hesitated, looking at Carl for direction. Carl shook his head sharply. You don't have the authority to demand that. John Wick took a slow step forward. Do it. The room was dead silent. Brittany's fingers trembled as she typed. More accounts appeared on the screen. More unnecessary fees. More hidden deductions. A low murmur spread through the bank. Customers exchanged glances, realizing they had all been deceived. John nodded. So it's not just Linda. He turned back to Carl. Tell me, do you check these fees? Or do you just assume the system is always right? Carl's mouth opened, but no words came out. John's eyes narrowed slightly. That's what I thought. A young man near the front, holding his phone, suddenly spoke up. I've been recording this the whole time. Carl's stomach dropped. John's expression remained unreadable, but something in his gaze flickered. Carl let out a shaky breath. Listen, let's not get ahead of ourselves. John folded his arms. You mean let's not expose you? Carl wiped his brow. Corporate handles these matters, not me. John sighed, almost as if he was disappointed. Then, he turned toward the customers. How many of you think this bank will refund you on its own? Not a single hand went up. John turned back to Carl, tilting his head slightly. That's a problem, don't you think? Carl's face was pale. John glanced at Brittany. Refund every single one. Brittany hesitated, waiting for Carl's approval. Carl clenched his fists. If he refused, this would get even worse. His career was already hanging by a thread. Do it, he muttered. Brittany moved quickly, reversing the charges across multiple accounts. Customers started checking their phones, seeing their balances return to normal. A quiet wave of approval spread through the crowd. Some whispered. Some nodded. Carl felt the walls closing in. John Wick took one last step toward him. Now. Apologize. Carl swallowed hard. Mrs. Carter, he began, his voice strained. I apologize for the misunderstanding. John raised an eyebrow. Carl's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I apologize for the way you were treated. It was unacceptable. Linda Carter held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Thank you. John Wick looked around the room, ensuring every customer had witnessed the moment. Then, without another word, he turned, put his coat back on, and walked toward the exit. Customers watched in silence. And just like that, John Wick was gone. The moment John Wick walked out of the bank, the atmosphere inside shifted. Customers who had once been silent now exchanged murmurs of approval. Employees, including Brittany, seemed unsure of how to react. Carl Jensen, who had exuded confidence and authority just moments ago, now stood frozen in place. His face was pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He had lost control of the situation in the worst possible way publicly, with witnesses, and on camera. The young man near the front, the one holding his phone, smirked. Already uploaded, buddy. You can't erase this. Carl's stomach sank. He had spent years dismissing complaints, pushing customers aside, believing that no one could challenge him. But now, his name and face were about to be all over the internet for the worst reason possible. Linda Carter, standing quietly by the counter, watched everything unfold with a newfound sense of satisfaction. She had walked into the bank feeling small, unheard, and powerless. Now, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: vindicated. For decades, she had taught her students to stand up for what was right. Today, a stranger had reminded her of that very lesson. The bank's phone rang. Brittany glanced at the caller ID, her eyes widening. It's corporate. Carl stiffened. He grabbed the phone and pressed it to his ear. This is Carl Jensen. A cold voice responded. Mr. Jensen, we need to talk. Now. Carl turned sharply and stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. It didn't take long for the video to spread. Within hours, social media exploded with outrage. Customers from other branches shared similar experiences. News outlets picked up the story. By the end of the week, First Pacific Bank's headquarters issued a public statement announcing an internal review of branch practices. And Carl Jensen? Gone. The official statement cited failure to uphold company values and multiple customer complaints. But everyone knew the truth: he had been exposed. Brittany Wallace was placed under review but ultimately kept her job. When questioned, she admitted that she had followed Carl's orders out of fear for her position. She expressed regret for how she had treated Linda and others like her. Most importantly, every single customer affected by the unnecessary fees was refunded in full. Linda watched it all unfold from the comfort of her home. She never thought a simple trip to the bank would turn into something this big. But she wasn't just relieved. She felt a quiet sense of victory. A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. It wasn't from the bank. The postmark read Los Angeles. Inside was a single handwritten note. Mrs. Carter, you didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength, you just needed someone to remind you. Hope this makes you smile. John. Tucked inside the envelope was a signed John Wick movie poster and a personal invitation to the premiere of his next film. Linda let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. She traced her fingers over the signature. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt valued. She felt unstoppable. Linda stood up, stretched, and walked to her front door, feeling lighter than she had in years. The world wasn't perfect. But now she knew, when you fight for what's right, sometimes the right people show up to fight with you.